You may not believe it, but those of us in the preaching profession sometimes wonder if it does any good. We work at our sermons week after week, study the scriptures, consult the commentaries. We jot down notes on paper napkins in restaurants, practice dramatic gestures, think out loud. And when Sunday comes, we stand in the pulpit with pounding hearts, say our piece, and then step down for the closing hymn, wondering if any of it has made any difference at all. I was at my first church 4.5 years. Those were good people there in that small Kentucky town. They were honest, hardworking, kind. But were they any better at the end of those 4.5 years than they were at the beginning? Had my preaching made any difference? I don't know. I was at my next church twice as long, 9 years. Those people, too, were fine Christians when I came and fine Christians when I left. But were they any finer? Had my preaching done anything for them? I'm not sure that it had. The same could be said for my church in Washington and the 7.5 years I spent climbing the steps of that impressive pulpit. Did my preaching leave any lasting impression on those people? Were they formed in any way by my many words? And after a dozen years at my current church, I wonder, have my carefully crafted sermons made any difference at all? It's hard to say. When a man digs a ditch, he knows at the end of the day just how much of the ditch he has dug. But when a man preaches a sermon, he can't tell, really, how much of his work has been done and how much is left to do. Now, I'm not saying this so you will tell me what a profound impact my preaching is having on your life. I'm only saying it because it's true. I work with words, not spades, and the digging that I do is not the kind that can be easily seen. It is measured in inches, not feet. If preaching has any results at all, they are often inner and invisible, and that's why ministers are often tempted to spend their time on other, more measurable things. I got a call from a former seminary classmate once who told me that he was going into full-time evangelism. How did you make that decision, I asked. And he talked about being in Russia when Billy Graham was there, about having the opportunity to preach once himself and seeing people respond by the hundreds, he said, to his invitation. I can understand the appeal of that kind of ministry. How satisfying it would be to say at the end of a week, 100 more souls saved. Guess I can take tomorrow off. Ministers often get involved in building programs before they really need to so they can see some results from their labor. So they can point back at the end of their tenure and say, well, at least there's that. Others spend time in counseling or visiting, both of which can be more rewarding than the time it takes to prepare a thoughtful sermon. Preaching is like cooking, and the lasting benefits of serving a meal and delivering a sermon are roughly the same. At least, that's how it seems. At one of my churches, I knew a man who was confined to a wheelchair. He was a university professor, just about my age. And the interesting thing about his story is that he hadn't always been in a wheelchair. He told me that one afternoon when he was a teenager, he played basketball with his brother. And when he woke up the next morning, he couldn't feel his legs. From that morning to this one, he has not been able to walk. That kind of tragedy can make you bitter, or it can make you better. In Greg's case, it made him better. He began to focus his energies on his studies, exploring his love for mathematics, and eventually producing a 600-page doctoral dissertation. After his father's death, Greg was a great comfort to his mother. And somehow in his care for her and her care for him, she made it through her grief. She told me once about her son, Greg. He is the best person I know. Well, He's the best person a lot of people know. He's patient, thoughtful, funny, and wise. He is loved by the people of that little town, by his students at the university, and by the members of his church family. It was one of those, a member of his church family, who once asked me what I would do if I were Jesus. If I were Jesus? Yeah. What would you do? I guess I would try to do the things Jesus did. I mean, I'm not sure I could improve on that. How about you? He was quiet for a moment, thoughtful, and then he said, I would heal Greg. And then we were both quiet, imagining Greg getting up out of that chair, standing straight and tall, taking his first steps in more than 30 years. If my friend were Jesus, that's what he would do. Which raised for both of us the question, why didn't Jesus do it? In our gospel lesson for this morning, we learned that one of the things Jesus did very early in his ministry was heal the sick. He came to Simon Peter's house after synagogue on the Sabbath and found Peter's mother-in-law in bed with a high fever. He took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she began to serve them their dinner. News of that healing got out the door somehow, and all over that small town, so that by sundown, when the Sabbath officially ended, Jesus had plenty of work to do. Mark says that the whole city was gathered around the door. Now, tell me the truth. If you knew there was someone in your town who could heal the sick, or even if you only thought he might be able to heal the sick, isn't there someone you would want to bring to him? Isn't there some wheelchair somewhere you would want to roll up to his door? Some hospital bed you would want to push through the streets? Maybe you would want to bring yourself under your own power for the healing you alone know that you need. Can you imagine standing before him as he looks into your eyes and asks, what do you need me to do for you? What kind of healing do you want? Whatever their reasons, everybody in the little town of Capernaum found some reason to be outside the door where Jesus was in the hope that he could heal. And he did heal. He worked late into the night, apparently, curing many who were sick with various diseases and casting out demons. He was a sensation. And the sensation created a crisis in his ministry. Mark tells us that Jesus was tempted by Satan in the wilderness, but he doesn't give us many details. You have to look to Matthew or Luke for that. There we learn that Satan tempted him, first of all, by asking him to turn stones into bread. It would have been a good thing to do. There were so many stones out there in the wilderness that if anyone could turn them into bread, that person could feed the nation, could feed the world. And that would be a good thing, wouldn't it? Behind Satan's suggestion that Jesus turned stones into bread to feed his own hunger was the more subtle temptation to feed the world's hunger. And Jesus must have labored over his answer. Man does not live by bread alone, he said at last, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. It was a recognition of the difference between those things that are temporal and those things that are eternal. Feed someone today and you will need to feed him again tomorrow, but give him the word of life and he can live forever. Does that mean that we have no obligation to feed the hungry? Of course it doesn't. We collect food at my church week after week. We store it on shelves in our food pantry. We put it in bags and give it to those people who need it. As long as there are hungry people in the world, the followers of Jesus will have an obligation to feed them, as he did when the multitudes were hungry. But both he and we know that there is a difference between that which fills the belly and that which feeds the soul. One lasts for a few hours, the other can last forever. But think back to that evening in Capernaum when Jesus was touching and healing the sick. Think of the wonder on their faces, the gratitude. As crippled limbs were straightened, as atrophied muscles grew strong, as people walked who hadn't walked in years, as they leaped and danced and whirled about. Think of those who were doubled over with illness, standing straight and tall. Those who were covered with weeping sores, becoming clean and whole. Those who were dying of disease, feeling healthy and strong and able again. Could there be anything on earth more satisfying than having that power and using it for that purpose? The gratitude would have been overwhelming. The response, enormous. News would have spread like wildfire across the Galilee, and every person who could push a wheelchair would be pushing one fast to that place where Jesus was. These are the thoughts that must have been going through his head as he tried to sleep that night. Exhausted by the day's events, he would have fallen into bed sometime after midnight and dropped off immediately. But after a few hours, after the strength had come back into his tired body, he would have started to stir. I would have seen their faces again, the desperate need that was there. The hands reaching out toward him, trying to touch him. The mothers holding out their babies. The fathers bringing their sons. He would have tossed and turned on his narrow bed, reliving the whole experience until sometime long before daybreak, he got up from his bed and slipped out the door to find a quiet place to pray. He went to the wilderness, Mark says, a word that has been used only once before in this gospel. The wilderness is where the Spirit drove him to be tempted by Satan. And on that morning in Capernaum, it seemed that the Spirit was driving him again to that place where he could wrestle with this temptation to be a healer, and perhaps a healer only. We don't know how long he spent in prayer, but eventually his disciples came looking for him. They hunted him down, Mark says. They found him out there in the wilderness, and they said to him, "Master, everybody is looking for you." And you know what they were thinking. "Master, come back to Capernaum. Come back and begin that healing ministry again." They could almost see where all of this was taking them. They would build a clinic right there in Capernaum. They would pave a few acres for a parking lot. They would put a sign over the door that said, "Real miracles, sensibly priced." Jesus would have a healing ministry in Capernaum that would be popular everywhere. His mission was settled, at least as far as the disciples were concerned. But not as far as Jesus was concerned. He looked at those disciples and said to them, "Let us go on to the other towns also, so that I can preach the word. For this is why I came out." And in that moment, Jesus said it. My mission is not to heal all the sick of the world, but to preach that life-giving word. If any of us ever wonder if preaching makes any difference, here is the answer Jesus gives. It does. It can make all the difference in the world. It is the reason that I came.